Welcome back, everyone. For our first plenary session of the conference, we thank Centre Jules Leger for their sponsorship of this session. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker, we have greetings to share with you from the Honorable Carla Quattro, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion of Canada.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carla Qualtrough, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion. Thank you for inviting me to take part in the Deafblind International World Conference today. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm joining you from the traditional Indigenous territory of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam First Nations. This conference is about something very close to my heart, building a more inclusive country and world for persons with disabilities. I'm very thankful to the Deafblind Network of Ontario. Your advocacy and support for Ontarians who are deafblind is absolutely essential to our work on disability inclusion. We need this advocacy. The deafblind community in Canada is diverse. You all have different and unique circumstances and experiences. Each one of you brings different talents, perspectives, and ideas to the table. You have so much to offer our communities and our country. We all know this. And we also know that the history of how we have treated persons with disabilities in this country is not a proud one. I can confidently say, though, that this is changing, perhaps not as quickly as many of us would like, but it is changing. I know this to be the case because of what we have accomplished working together over the past years. I'm proud to say Canada is committed to the social and economic inclusion of persons with disabilities. As a country and as a member of the global community, we want to do better and be better. The Accessible Canada Act, which became law in 2019, is the most significant piece of legislation for the rights of persons with disabilities since our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in October 2022, the Government of Canada released our first ever Disability Inclusion Action Plan. In the spirit of nothing without us, we engaged a broad cross-section of disability stakeholders on the 4 key pillars of financial security, employment, accessible and inclusive communities, and a modern approach to disability. With 2 key milestones, we have a legal and policy framework for disability inclusion for the first time in our country's history. We have an independent organization whose job it is to create national accessibility standards. We now have a Chief Accessibility Officer for the Government of Canada. We have an Accessibility Commissioner at the Canadian Human Rights Commission. We have changed other laws and policies as well. We have incorporated disability inclusion into broader Government of Canada programs, and we have made historic investments in accessibility and disability inclusion. At the end of June, Bill C-22, the Canada Disability Benefit Act, received royal assent, creating a new and permanent improvement to Canada's social safety net. Modeled after our guaranteed income supplement for seniors, the CDB will be a monthly direct paid supplement for working age, low-income persons with disabilities. This benefit will improve the financial security of persons with disabilities and lift many out of poverty. We're also launching an employment strategy for persons with disabilities to help persons with disabilities find and keep good jobs and help them advance in their careers or become entrepreneurs. It will also support employers as they develop inclusive and accessible workplaces, as well as support organizations and individuals who help persons with disabilities get jobs. In everything we have done and in everything we intend to do, we have engaged and continue to engage the disability community in Canada for advice, perspectives, and feedback. Persons with disabilities know best what we need. If we want to get this right, we can't impose a solution on a community that has been imposed on for generations. There's so much work left to be done, but I'm proud of our progress here in Canada. And I'll say, we are seeing momentum around the world. Countries are at different points in how we support persons with disabilities, which provides us with an opportunity to learn from one another on how we can all do better. This year, I attended the G7 conference where disability inclusion was one of the primary topics of conversation, which is incredible to finally see on the world stage. I am hopeful. Together, we can build an inclusive world for persons with disabilities because that's the world we deserve. The progress we have made is the result of decades of relentless advocacy on the part of the disability community, What disability rights advocates have fought for and have achieved matters and have made a difference. I encourage you to keep building leadership, relationships, and momentum as a community, and together we'll continue to make a difference. Thank you again for having me. Let's continue our work together because we will be amazed at who and what we become as a nation when every single person has the chance to participate.
It is now my pleasure to welcome to our stage Michael Gottheil, Canada's first Accessibility Commissioner appointed under the Accessible Canada Act. Mr. Gottheil brings many years of leadership experience in the administrative justice sector, having previously served as Chief of Commission and Tribunals of the Alberta Human Rights Commission, Chair of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, and Executive Chair of both the Environment and Land Tribunals Ontario and the Social Justice Tribunals Ontario. A graduate of Gottheil Law School, he has also practiced labor, employment, and human rights law for close to 20 years. He is a frequent presenter at conferences and seminars and has written widely on human rights, accessibility and inclusion, administrative law, institutional design, and alternative models of dispute resolution. Mr. Gottheil has always been open to sharing his experiences and to be inquisitive about others' differences, challenge, and insights. He is a firm believer that by listening and hearing diverse perspectives, we all grow stronger individually and as a community. His journey living with vision loss has informed his collaboration with the disability community and all those who are committed to equity and human rights. Please give a big DBI welcome to Michael Gottheil.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you to the DBI and the organizers. Before I start, I have to say that I only found out yesterday by email that there was going to be a video message from Minister Qualtrough, and I almost decided to withdraw. She is a tough act to follow, I have to say. For those of you from Canada, you'll know that Minister Qualtrough is a giant amongst the disability advocates and activists here in this country. I have heard no less from the Prime Minister that Minister Qualtrough is always a stalwart defender and promoter of the rights of people with disabilities in Canada. And we know that not just in the legislation that she has been responsible for introducing and shepherding through Parliament, like the Accessible Canada Act, and more recently, the Canada Disability Benefits Act and other legislation. But I'm told she brings a disability lens to every discussion around the cabinet table. And I know for all of us, again, from Canada, we're just so, amazed at her commitment and her perseverance and her leadership. So I just want to thank, why don't we all have another round of applause for Minister Qualtrough. So the other thing, I know that it's de rigueur now to describe yourself before you begin speaking. For me, unfortunately, the last time I could actually see my reflection in the mirror was about 20 years ago. So I am 5'10", not an ounce of fat on me, a full head of hair with no gray. Also, I should mention, my guide dog Kirby is with me on stage. You may hear him start to snore It's not that he's 9.5 years old. He's just heard everything I've had to say before. So in any event, again, yes, I really want to thank DBI for inviting me. It's an honor. It's a pleasure. It's also quite exhilarating. It's the word I would use, to be amongst so many fellow travelers. We're all around here committed to the rights of people with disabilities, particularly people who are deaf and deaf-blind, the right to housing and education, the right to employment and economic security, the right to health care, and many more rights. In that sense, I really feel I'm amongst not only the people around the table who are people with disabilities, but their allies and their families. So yes, I feel that I'm amongst fellow travelers on the journey to create a more equitable world and a better world. So I'd also say about, speaking about traveling, I think it's just amazing that we're all here today from across Canada, from around the world. It's amazing that, over 500 people have been able to travel to this place, to this space this week, because it's not that long ago that people with disabilities were not allowed to travel independently or travel at all. It's not that long ago that planes and trains, buses, automobiles, taxis, even the streets and roadways, sidewalks, didn't even have minimal accessibility. So I think we need to celebrate the work that we've done, the gains that we've made in accessibility. I also think that travel is important in another way. To be able to travel really provides us as people with disabilities the opportunity to be out in the world. It gives us a sense of dignity and respect, of being able to participate. Some of you may be familiar with the name Jacobus Tenbroek, who was a blind lawyer, one of the founders of the National Federation of the Blind, certainly a leader in the inclusion movement. In 1966, he wrote an article, The Right to Be in the World, and he said that nothing is more central to personality, to social existence, to participate in the community as having the ability, the physical ability, the public approval, and the legal rights to be abroad in the land. So I think that's so true. I often come back to that passage because I think it's so important. Because again, if we think back, or for those of you who are as old as me, or if you are students of the history of the disability movement, you'll know that in 1966 and around that time, people with disabilities were often lived in residences. People who are deaf-blind or blind or deaf lived in residences or were housed in asylums and institutions. And, Tenbroek always, he asked the question, will people with disabilities be allowed to leave their institutions and asylums, the homes of their families? And if they are allowed to leave, will they be confined to the front porch, or will they be able to go out onto the streets and roadways? Will they be able to travel on planes and trains and taxis? Will they be able to receive services in hotel and restaurants and other forms of accommodation? And I think we have come a long way. And I think we need to celebrate those successes as people with disabilities, as the allies and families and everyone who struggles for the rights of disabilities. I think we need to celebrate that. And, you know, as the movement for disability justice, of course, relied on, and people with disabilities fought for and used laws to advance their rights. You know, as early as the first human rights code, I think in North America, but certainly in Canada, was passed in 1962, the Ontario Human Rights Code. Although disability wasn't added as a ground of discrimination until 1981, 82. But in the decades that followed, every province and territory in Canada and the federal government passed disability human rights legislation, which prevented discrimination against people with disabilities. And what was, I think, really remarkable when you think about it at the time, not only did human rights legislation, anti-discrimination legislation, say that you couldn't discriminate against people with disabilities in employment or housing or in the provision of services, but it actually said where structures or the built environment, policies, practices meant that people with disabilities were excluded or disadvantaged, there was an obligation on the service provider, government, the employer, to meet the individual needs of the person to the point of undue hardship. And so this was significant legislation. But the thing about anti-discrimination legislation, of course, is, as people with disabilities know, it requires the elimination of barriers one legal case at a time, and often at great cost, emotional and financial cost to the person filing the complaint. And of course, oftentimes it took many months or even years for the cases to wind their way through commissions, tribunals, and the courts. And so I think following on the heels in many ways of the 1990 Americans for Disabilities Act, in Canada, we advocated for accessibility legislation. The first real accessibility legislation was 2005, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Since that time, a number of provinces have instituted their own accessibility legislation. And of course, most recently, in 2019, Canada unanimously passed the Accessible Canada Act, which promises barrier-free Canada by 2040 or before. And the thing about accessibility legislation that I think is quite innovative and novel, first of all, it is based upon the principle that disability is often, or most often, a function of the physical environment, policies, procedures, practices, structures, and even attitudes, more so than the impairment. So, for example, you know, a blind person may not have full access to a bus or a subway because there's no audio announcements of stops or braille markers on doorways and so forth. People with who use wheelchairs can't enter buildings. Their disability flows from the fact that the buildings don't only have stairs and not ramps or elevators. And so this is sometimes called the social model of disability. And it flips what disability means on its head. It's not about impairments, it's about the environment we live in. And secondly, accessibility legislation places an obligation on governments, employers, landlords, service providers to identify and remove disabling barriers proactively, not waiting around for a complaint to be filed. And there's a process in accessibility legislation that to develop standards, minimal accessibility standards that set out the requirements, the obligations of service providers and employers and so forth. And those standards are to be developed in consultation with and participation from people with disabilities. So it really embeds the principle of nothing about us without us. So before, I know many of you are thinking, well, this is all a rosy picture, but it's not always that. Before I talk about some of the limits of law, I just want to also mention the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the CRPD, passed by the UN General Assembly in 2006. In Canada, it was adopted in 2010. And the CRPD is quite remarkable in a number of ways. It's the first human rights convention of the 21st century. It's the first convention to allow for non-state signatories. It's the first convention that actually requires governments and countries to establish monitoring bodies. And my colleagues at the Canadian Human Rights Commission are assigned that task of the monitoring Canada's commitments and implementation of the CRPD. It's really a remarkable document. Many of you will have seen it. I would say you should. If you're interested in a book that traces the history and background and the collaborations of people with disabilities and disability activist groups and support organizations, there's a really good book called Human Rights and Disability Advocacy, which really is a wonderful history. So let me ask this question to the audience. How many of you in coming here had a completely seamless experience, an experience where you did not face any barriers whatsoever? I would suspect not many. And the question is, why is that? With all our laws and the commitments and the legislation and so forth, why do we still face barriers? Why don't we live in an accessible country or world? And there's probably a number of reasons. Maybe it's that there's not enough laws in Canada. Not all provinces have adopted accessibility legislation. Perhaps it's, there's not always a firm commitment to laws that are passed or the grand principles in the CRPD that are adopted by countries. Perhaps there's not sufficient enforcement mechanisms or not enough resources provided to commissions and legal clinics and so forth that are responsible for or may help enforce the various human rights and accessibility legislation. So all of this is probably true, and we can see that. Recently, some of you may know, in Ontario, the latest review of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODA, that was issued by Rich Donovan, found that it's impossible that Ontario will be fully accessible by 2 years from now, 2025, which was the commitment in the 2005 Act. Even the Accessible Canada Act, passed in 2019, promises an accessible Canada by 2040 or before. To date, there's only one standard passed, one regulation passed, and that doesn't even set out substantive obligations on entities to bring in, to remove barriers. So we only have 17 years to go. There's a lot of work to do, but people with disabilities, as I said before, continue to push, continue to prod, continue to advocate for the laws and the enforcement of laws. So I'm just going to check time. Okay. So my next question is, even if we are able to achieve a fully accessible Canada, an accessible world, will that mean we have an inclusive world? I mean, we also often talk about accessibility and inclusion. Will the laws actually get us to full inclusion? I want to tell you a story that happened to me a few years ago. I was living in Toronto. I was the chair of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, the body that enforces the Human Rights Code in Ontario. And I'd gone out with a colleague for lunch at a Japanese restaurant just on the corner, and I walked in, and the server came up and said, "No dogs." And I said, "Well, he's a service dog. You have to you have to let us in. No dogs." I said, "Well, the law says I'm allowed to come in with a service dog." The server said, "No dogs." And then the chef comes out from behind the counter, and he's carrying this huge cleaver. It's big enough even I can see it. And he says, "No dogs." And there's this standoff. And I know Kirby's saying to himself, "Okay, boss, we're out of here. That guy has a knife." But finally, this couple that was sitting next to where I was standing said, "Oh, you have to let them in. It's the law." So it kind of backed down. We sat down. We had a perfectly nice meal. Anyway, I go back to the office, and I tell some of my colleagues who are, human rights adjudicators, judges, about what happened. And somebody said, "Oh, you should file a human rights complaint." So we were having a discussion. I said, "Well, if I filed a complaint, what do you think I would get?" And, the consensus was about $5,000. Well, first of all, I couldn't file a human rights complaint because I would chair the Human Rights Tribunal. It would create a constitutional crisis or something. Anyway, but really, it wasn't about the money. Now, I know if there's any lawyers in the room, or I can tell you as a lawyer, when a client says, "Oh, it's not about the money," eyes roll. This person is naive. Like, what do you think? Well, and it's because the law, in generally, really is designed to deal with money claims. It is designed to say, if you have been wronged, quantify your losses in some way, and then the system will work with that claim, that money claim, and try to resolve it or issue an award. But what if it's not about the money, really? Because I think for many people with disabilities, it's not always about the money. It's about being understood. For me, at that time, what I really wanted was to talk to the owner and say, "Well, do you know about guide dogs? Do you know about people who are blind that use guide dogs? Do you know about the law? Why don't you want to let me in? Did you have a bad experience? Is it something cultural? Is the bylaw not written in a language that, other than English?" So, the owner couldn't understand it, maybe, if English and French weren't his first language. Like, the law is good at saying, "Okay, what do you want? Money. Okay, here's the money. Everyone goes away, never see each other again, and probably don't like each other very much after the whole process." And yet, for people with disabilities, the thing we miss is interaction, human interaction. We're often, you know, one of the things many people with disabilities, when you read narratives talking about the lives of people with disability, they're often saying, well, my world got really small once I developed a disability. You know, I couldn't get out. I couldn't cross the street. There's no ramp. There's no access. And so what we crave for is what I sometimes call the human in human rights. So I think that's one thing. I think we also have to sort of interrogate what we mean by inclusion. You know, oftentimes I think when people talk about inclusion, when governments or employers say, oh yeah, we want to create an inclusive workplace, what they're really meaning is sort of like, well, we'll tolerate your needs for accommodation, right? So inclusion is really about being tolerated, you know, and what's worse is the service provider or the employer is all of a sudden cast as being the tolerant one, and we're things that are being tolerated, and that doesn't feel right. I think the second thing that I feel often is that inclusion means being welcome, which is fine, but that even feels like, you know, you go to a hotel and you know, the front desk clerk or the concierge says, oh, Mr. Gottheil, welcome. Let us know if there's anything we can do to make your stay more comfortable. But don't think you can stay here indefinitely, and don't walk around thinking you own the place. So that doesn't really feel like inclusion. I think inclusion is more about creating a shared space, a place that we contribute to, a place that we're at the table and sometimes even being at the head of the table. I think people with disabilities have a lot to contribute and offer. You know, it reminds me, I was told some time ago that in many Indigenous communities, disability isn't seen as a negative. People with disabilities are seen as having gifts, special gifts that where they can contribute to community well-being. And I think that's just a wonderful way of thinking about it. It also reminds me of a passage from a book called The Last Speakers by Dan Harrison. He says, and I'm not quoting exactly, but he said that we will need the sum of all human knowledge as encoded in every language to help us understand and care for our world at a time when humanity faces its most existential challenges. The loss of any language means another strategy for survival is thrown away. And I think that's so profound, and I think that can apply to our voices as people with disabilities. And you know what? We're there. You know, we're there. We're ready. You know, we're here. We're occupying this place. We're occupying spaces. We've come a long way. We've traveled a long way. But there ain't no stopping us now. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. Your words have been very meaningful and inspiring. I think the work that you have done and shared with us is quite admirable. So thank you so much for traveling and joining us. And I actually have a gift for you.
Oh, okay.
So you can just put that into your hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Oh,
So it's not like me to stand between you and lunch. So I just want to let you know that it is, lunch today is generously sponsored by Lions McGuinness House. If you would like to make your way to Canada Hall 2 next door, during the break, please visit our exhibits, and Group B posters will also be presented at that time. Following lunch, we have 2 more concurrent sessions to enjoy. Then we will all meet back here in Canada Hall 1 at 3:45 for our next plenary session, where we will hear from the leaders of the Deafblind Global Organizations, the President of Deafblind International, and the President of the World Federation of the Deafblind. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your lunch.